There comes a point in life where experience becomes your greatest advantage. You've seen how quickly situations can change, how important preparation is, and how responsibility carries more weight than ever before. But what many people don't realize is that, as you get older, the legal landscape around self-defense and firearm ownership doesn't stay the same. Certain rights become more relevant, certain risks become more serious, and certain misunderstandings can have consequences that most people never see coming. So here's the question. Do you think older, law-abiding gun owners are fully aware of their legal rights and responsibilities, or are there important details that most people are missing? Share your answer in the comments. As we begin to break this down, it's important to approach this topic carefully and accurately. There are many claims online about hidden or forgotten gun rights, especially for individuals over the age of 55. In my legal analysis, the reality is less about secret rights and more about how existing laws apply differently, or more critically, as circumstances change with age, lifestyle, and legal exposure. The foundation of all firearm rights in the United States begins with the Second Amendment, which protects the right to keep and bear arms. However, that right has been interpreted and refined over time through Supreme Court decisions. Cases like District of Columbia versus Heller confirmed that individuals have a right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, such as self-defense, particularly within the home. Later, in McDonald versus City of Chicago, the court made it clear that this protection applies at the state level as well. And more recently, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin expanded the understanding of carrying firearms outside the home, reinforcing that self-defense is not limited to private spaces. But here's where things begin to shift in ways that many people don't fully consider. In my legal analysis, one of the most overlooked realities is that while the constitutional right itself does not change with age, the legal risks, expectations, and interpretations surrounding that right can become more significant over time. For example, courts often examine self-defense cases based on what is considered reasonable under the circumstances. That includes factors such as physical ability, perceived threat level, and proportional response. For older individuals, these factors can be interpreted differently, not as a limitation, but as part of the full context. There is a strong constitutional argument that the right to self-defense must account for individual circumstances, including age and physical capability. Courts would likely examine whether a person reasonably believed they were in danger and whether their response was justified given their situation. This is not about having more or fewer rights. It's about how those rights are applied in real-world scenarios. Now consider the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. This becomes especially relevant during interactions with law enforcement. For older individuals who may be more likely to carry medications, medical devices, or travel with certain personal items, the context of a search can become more complex. Similarly, the Fifth Amendment, which includes protections against self-incrimination, plays a role in how individuals communicate during legal encounters. In my legal analysis, one of the most important factors is not just knowing your rights, but understanding how to exercise them calmly, clearly, and lawfully. Because how something is said can matter just as much as what is said. Now let's talk about something that often gets misunderstood: the idea of special rights for seniors. Legally speaking, there are no separate Second Amendment rights that apply only to individuals over 55. However, there are legal realities that become more relevant with age, and these are often what people refer to when they talk about forgotten rights. For example, self-defense laws are often based on the concept of reasonable fear. An older individual may reasonably perceive a threat differently than a younger person in the same situation. Courts would likely examine that perception within the full context, including physical limitations or vulnerability. This does not create a different law. It creates a different application of the same law. Another important factor is the concept of duty to retreat versus stand-your-ground laws. These laws vary by state, and they determine whether an individual is required to attempt to avoid confrontation before using force in self-defense. For someone over 55, the practicality of retreating may be different than for someone younger. In my legal analysis, this can influence how a situation is evaluated, even though the legal standard itself remains the same. Now let's consider federal versus state law, because this is where many misunderstandings arise. Gun laws are not uniform across the United States. Each state has its own regulations regarding concealed carry, open carry, transportation, and use of force. While federal law provides a baseline, the details are often determined at the state level. This means that what is legal in one state may be restricted in another. For older individuals who travel frequently or split time between different locations, this becomes particularly important. Courts would likely examine whether an individual made a reasonable effort to comply with applicable laws, especially in cases where there is confusion about jurisdiction. And that brings us to real-world impact. For many lawful gun owners over 55, the goal is not just protection, it's peace of mind. But peace of mind comes from clarity, not assumption. In my legal analysis, one of the most significant risks is not intentional wrongdoing, but misunderstanding, believing something is allowed when it is not. Assuming a right applies in a certain way without verifying it. These are the kinds of situations that can lead to legal complications, even for individuals who are otherwise fully responsible and law-abiding. At the same time, supporters of strong Second Amendment protections argue that individuals should not have to navigate overly complex legal systems to exercise a fundamental right. They emphasize clarity, accessibility, and consistency. On the other hand, those who support more regulation often point to public safety concerns and the need for structured legal frameworks that address modern realities. Both perspectives influence how laws are written and how courts interpret them. Now, looking ahead, the legal landscape is continuing to evolve. Courts are refining how self-defense laws are applied. Legislatures are updating statutes, and public awareness is growing. In my legal analysis, the long-term trend is toward more detailed interpretation rather than broad simplification. Laws are becoming more defined in some areas, but also more nuanced in others. And that makes one thing very clear: understanding your rights is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing responsibility. Because when a real situation arises, there is no time to research, no time to guess, and no room for misunderstanding. There is only what you know and how you apply it. So as we continue, think about this. How confident are you, not just in your rights, but in your understanding of how those rights actually work in real-world situations? Because in the next part, we're going to go deeper into specific legal scenarios, how courts evaluate self-defense decisions, and what older gun owners need to be especially aware of moving forward. If you're finding this helpful, stay with me, because the next part connects these legal principles to real-life situations in a way that could make a meaningful difference in how you think about responsibility, protection, and the law. As we continue, it becomes clear that the real issue is not whether rights exist, they do, but how those rights are understood and applied when it matters most. Think about a situation that unfolds in seconds. A sudden confrontation, an unexpected threat. There is no pause button, no time to analyze legal theory. And yet, everything that happens in that moment will later be evaluated through a legal lens. In my legal analysis, this is where one of the most important realities emerges. Self-defense law is not judged based on what a person intended alone, but on what a reasonable person in that situation would have believed and done. For individuals over 55, that standard does not change, but the context does. Courts would likely examine factors such as mobility, reaction time, physical strength, and overall vulnerability when determining whether a response was reasonable. There is a strong constitutional argument that the law must account for real human differences, not apply a one-size-fits-all expectation. This becomes especially relevant when discussing proportional force. The use of force in self-defense must generally be proportionate to the threat faced. But proportionality is not measured in abstract terms. It is measured in context. What may be considered a manageable threat for one person could be significantly more serious for another, depending on their physical condition and ability to respond. In my legal analysis, this is one of the most misunderstood areas. Many people assume that the law draws rigid lines, but in reality, it evaluates circumstances. Now consider another layer: location. Self-defense laws often vary depending on where an incident occurs. Inside the home, many states apply some form of what is commonly referred to as the castle doctrine, which generally allows individuals to defend themselves without a duty to retreat. Outside the home, the rules may change. Some states follow stand-your-ground principles, while others impose a duty to retreat if it is safe to do so. For older individuals, this distinction can be critical. The ability to retreat safely is not always equal across all age groups. Courts would likely examine whether retreat was realistically possible, not just theoretically available. And this is where legal clarity becomes essential, because misunderstanding these differences can lead to decisions that carry serious consequences. Now let's talk about interaction with law enforcement, because this is another area where legal awareness plays a key role. After any self-defense incident, the situation does not end. It transitions into a legal process. Statements made, actions taken, and even demeanor can all become part of how the event is evaluated. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and the Fifth Amendment provides important protections related to self-incrimination. However, these rights must be exercised lawfully and respectfully. In my legal analysis, one of the most important principles is maintaining calm, clear communication while understanding the boundaries of your rights. Escalation, even unintentional, can complicate a situation that is already under scrutiny. This is not about fear, it's about awareness. Now consider the role of documentation and compliance. For lawful gun owners, especially those who carry or travel, maintaining proper licensing, understanding reciprocity between states, and following storage requirements are all essential. These are not minor technicalities. They are part of legal compliance. Failure to follow these requirements can lead to penalties, even if there was no intent to violate the law. In my legal analysis, this is where many responsible individuals face unexpected risk, not because they acted recklessly, but because they relied on outdated or incomplete information. And this brings us to the broader legal environment. Supporters of strong self-defense rights argue that the law should provide clear protection for individuals who act responsibly in defense of themselves or others. They emphasize that hesitation or uncertainty in critical moments can have real consequences. On the other hand, those who advocate for more structured regulations argue that clear boundaries are necessary to ensure accountability and prevent misuse. They point to the importance of consistent standards that can be applied fairly across different situations. Both perspectives influence how laws are written and how courts interpret them. Looking forward, the legal system is likely to continue refining how self-defense laws are applied, particularly as cases involving different age groups, physical conditions, and real-world scenarios come before the courts. In my legal analysis, the long-term direction is toward more detailed and context-sensitive interpretations. Courts will continue to ask not just what happened, but why it happened, and whether it aligns with established legal standards. And that brings us to the most important takeaway. Rights come with responsibility, not just the responsibility to act lawfully, but the responsibility to understand the law before a situation arises. Because in the moment, there is no time to second guess. There is only the reality of the situation, and the legal framework that will later define it. So the question is not just whether you have the right to defend yourself. The question is whether you understand how that right is viewed, applied, and evaluated in the real world. Now, as we come to the end of this discussion, I want to leave you with one final question to think about carefully. Do you believe the current self-defense laws provide enough clarity for responsible individuals, especially those over 55, to act with confidence? Or do you think there is still too much uncertainty in how these situations are judged? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. If you found this breakdown helpful and want more clear, fact-based legal explanations that apply to real-life situations, make sure to subscribe and stay informed. Because when it comes to your rights, your safety, and the law, what you understand today can shape what happens tomorrow.